James was the oldest son of the Hill family. His sister Kim was 5 years younger, and at the age of 11 was the baby of the family. Their father Travis worked at the local garage as a mechanic, and their mother Erin was an elementary school teacher. They didn't have a lot of money and things got rough at times, but they always seemed to come out on top. James was your typical moody teen, but all things considered, was a good kid. Kim, on the other hand, was more of a troublemaker. She got away with most of it because she was a world-class liar, and it was hard to believe someone so cute and innocent looking could be the devil in disguise. James was walking Kim home from school one afternoon and stopped at the corner store to grab a soda on the way. "Don't steal anything. I'm not fucking around, Kim. I swear, if you get us in trouble, I'm snitching." Smiling at him, she held up both hands and rolled her eyes. "Who? Me? I would never do something like that. Besides, if you tell on me, I'll tell on you." Narrowing his eyes at her, he had to smile. She was always quick with a comeback, and as much as he wanted to be mad at her, he just couldn't. "Whatever," he said, holding the door open for her. Reaching up and slapping him across the cheek as she passed by, she giggled, "Tag, you're it!" then sprinted away, running through the store. He chased her for a few steps before the lady behind the counter yelled out, "Stop all that messing around! You break it, you bought it." Kim responded by waving and giving her a big smile, saying, "Hey, Miss Margaret, sorry about that." The whole time her free hand was stuffing candy in her pocket. James let out a sigh and smiled to himself while walking to the cooler to grab an ice-cold cherry limeade. Pulling the bottle from the rack, he called out to his sister, "Do you want something to drink, Dot?" Dot was the nickname her father had given her. He said it was because she looked like some cartoon character he watched growing up. She danced over to the cooler, listening to the radio playing behind the counter, and stopped. Kim stood there, looking at all the different types of drinks to pick from, while humming along to the tune in the background. James was getting impatient, and she knew it, but that was half the fun of picking out a new drink. Every time they stopped at the store, she would get a different soda just to bug him. "Will you please speed it the fuck up? I'd like to get home sometime today." She turned and stuck out her tongue at him while opening the cooler to pick out a strawberry cream soda. James knew she wasn't going to drink it, and it would just be wasting money, but he didn't care as long as she didn't do anything else while they were in the store. When they finally went to pay for their things, Miss Margaret was standing behind the counter, staring down at the cash register with a blank expression on her face. The DJ on the radio made a quick announcement. "You're listening to Dave in the afternoon, bringing change to the masses, one song at a time. You're going to love this one, boys and girls. It's a real headbanger." Some random guitar riff sounded off, and Miss Margaret screamed, then started slamming her head against the counter till she gashed open her forehead and collapsed. Kim gasped and went wide-eyed as James grabbed her by the arm and rushed out of the store. When they made it to the sidewalk, Miss Margaret had gotten back to her feet and came running towards the door. Keeping a firm grip on his sister's arm, they ran all the way home. Neither of their parents had made it in yet, but that wasn't unusual. They normally got home late on Fridays, so James wasn't surprised. Rushing inside, locking the door, he pulled his phone out of his pocket and called his father. "Hey, kiddo, what's going on?" he asked in his usual happy tone. James stuttered and stumbled, through his words nervously peeping out of the window. "Dad, I think Miss Margaret is chasing us. She went crazy at the store and now she's after us." Travis didn't respond for a second, and James could hear the radio playing the same song in the background. When he finally spoke up, he sounded strange. "I love this song." He hummed a couple of bars of the tune, then chuckled and said, "It's probably nothing to worry about, kiddo. I'll stop by there on the way home. You two stay out of trouble. I'll be done here in a few." The second he hung up the phone, Kim came rushing into the living room. "She's outside, standing in the street. You don't think she's mad about the candy, do you? I'll give it back, I swear." James shook his head and went to the window to look out at the street. "I don't think it's the candy, Dot. She's acting crazy. Maybe she's on meth or some shit. Dad said he was almost done at work, so he should be here soon. Why don't you go up to your room? If anything happens, I'll let you know." Miss Margaret eventually left, and an hour later their mother pulled into the driveway. By then James was in his room playing video games, and Kim was watching television. Opening the front door, Erin called out to the children, "Hey guys, could you come give me a hand? I've got a few bags to bring in." Pausing his game and heading for the stairs, he heard a familiar tune playing outside. Walking out of the front door, he could see Kim and his mum pulling grocery bags from the trunk, and as he headed towards them, the roar of an engine grabbed his attention. Looking down the street, he saw his father's truck speeding in their direction. The closer it got, James could see blood splattered across the hood, standing out against the white paint. "Mom!" he screamed, pointing to the truck. Kim, carrying a few bags, passed by him, heading inside, turning to look. They both watched as their mother smiled, then turned to wave at their father, who gunned his engine, aiming his truck directly at her. Everything happened so fast. In the blink of an eye, he jumped the curb and ploughed into her. There was an explosion of sound and a cascade of flying glass, leaving James paralysed by what was unfolding in front of him. He couldn't think. His body felt numb, and his mind went blank as his sister's horrified screams played out like white noise in the background. Tears rolled down his cheeks while he watched the door of the truck creak and whine open, allowing his father to stagger out onto the lawn. "Hey, kiddos, get over here and give old Dad a hug," he said, through a mouthful of cracked teeth and blood, while he stumbled towards his horrified children. Stepping back, James felt Kim tugging at his arm. Quickly glancing down at her, James grabbed her by the hand and ran inside. Slamming the door shut behind him, James dug his phone out of his pocket and called the police. 911, please state the nature of your emergency." "Hello, my name is James Hill. I live at..." He was cut off by the sound of his father slamming against the door, screaming, "Get out here and give me a hug!" Startled by the impact, he dropped the phone, turning around in time to see his father picking up a large flower pot off the front porch. Between Kim's screams and the chaotic nature of the situation, James couldn't think. He knew his parents kept a gun in their closet. He'd snuck it out a few times to shoot bottles with his friends at the rock quarry, but the idea of using it against his father made his stomach hurt. He yelled to his sister, "Run!" just as the flower pot came crashing through the window. Kim bolted up the stairs with James right behind her. He told her to hide while he made a dash to his parents' room. Trying to gather himself, he rushed to their closet, frantically searching for the weapon, grabbing the old shoebox off the top shelf and pulling the pistol from its hidden place. James couldn't keep his hands from trembling. "Get out here!" Travis yelled, running up the stairs. James was shaking uncontrollably. As he stepped out of the closet, gun in hand, he could hear his father getting closer by the second. and footsteps seemed so loud. And when the bathroom door flew open, James raised the gun and fired. Time seemed to stand still for the briefest of moments. James, with his eyes still squeezed shut, heard his father's body hit the ground with a thud. It felt like his world came crashing down around him as the reality of what just happened hit him. His stomach lurched and bile rushed into his throat, causing him to spew before blacking out. When he came to, the police were there. "Well, where's Kim?" he uttered as his vision cleared. "Your sister is with the officers downstairs," one of the paramedics said, helping him up from the floor. "Are you hurt?" Wiping his mouth and looking at his father's lifeless corpse laying in the doorway, James shook his head. "What about my mom? Is she—" He couldn't bring himself to ask the question as tears welled up in his eyes. The medic gave him a look that told him everything he needed to know. His heart sank and he broke down crying as they led him out of the house to Kim, who was being looked after by the police. They stood there, holding on to one another crying, while officers poured into their home. After a few minutes, screams could be heard from inside, followed by gunfire. Before anyone knew what was going on, Travis, now covered in blood, came racing out of the house. He snarled like a wild animal and dove on the first person he saw. They tussled on the ground for a moment before Travis bit into the officer's face, tearing away a huge mouthful of flesh. More officers rushed in an attempt to get him under control. They used tasers and batons, but they couldn't stop him. When they opened fire on him, James and Kim thought it was over, but he kept attacking until one of the officers finally shot him in the head. Later that night, at the police station, the two sat in the office waiting on their aunt to arrive and take them back to her house. Kim was asleep on a couch while James stood at the window watching the parking lot. He couldn't wrap his mind around what was happening. Why had his father done this? And what was going to happen to them now they were alone in the world? The sound of Kim waking up finally snapped him out of his daze, and he turned to look at her. Kim yawned and stretched before sitting up and looking at him. "Do you think Miss Martha is still after us?" James looked at her for a second, puzzled by her question. She smiled and scratched her head, looking around the room. "Mom and Dad are going to be mad. I didn't know she was going to chase us. Are we in trouble?" Getting up from the couch, she started humming a little tune. James didn't know if she was joking or if she really didn't remember what had just happened. "Doc, are you okay? You're acting weird. You know Mom and Dad are—" He stopped himself. For some reason he just couldn't bring himself to say it. Now dancing, Kim made her way over to where he was standing, stopped, smiled, and slapped him on the face. "Tag, you're it," she giggled, and ran to the door, throwing it open, sprinting off down the hall. "Get back here!" he yelled after her, watching her dart down the hall, disappearing around a corner. Running to catch up to her, James stopped at the end of the hall. The place was a madhouse. Even though he'd never been in the police station, he couldn't believe how many people were being brought in. There were literally people everywhere, and all of them were acting crazy. Some were screaming while others laughed hysterically. There were even a few that were banging their heads against the wall. Confused by the situation, he stopped for a second, looking around, but there was no time. He had to catch Kim before she'd gotten them in trouble. Scanning the busy room for any sign of her, he caught a glimpse of her purple jacket speeding around another corner. Weaving through the crowd, he made his way over and spotted her going through a door. James ran as fast as he could and followed her in. Pushing through the door, he found himself in a room filled with filing cabinets. "Kim, come on! Stop messing around. We're not supposed to be in here," he called out, slowly moving through, trying to catch sight of her. He'd made it halfway down the first aisle when the lights went off. Kim's voice called to him from somewhere in the darkness. "Come and get me!" He could hear the squeaking of her tennis shoes against the tile floor as she ran, laughing the whole time. "This isn't funny, Dot. You're going to get us in some serious trouble. Turn on the lights and quit fucking around." He was trying his best not to lose his temper, but with all they'd been through, it wasn't working. Something slammed into his left leg, and a stinging sensation made him yelp, "Shit!" Before he could say anything else, the lights clicked back on, and there she was holding a stapler and smiling. Looking down at his leg, he saw the staple stuck in his calf. Kim laughed and pointed at him, saying, "Gotcha!" as an officer came storming towards them. "You two shouldn't be in here," the burly officer said, with an angry expression on his face. Turning on the charm, Kim smiled at him and apologised. When it was all said and done, they didn't get in any trouble for the stunt, but they remained locked in an office until their Aunt Tabitha arrived to pick them up. Tabitha was their father's sister. Needless to say, she wasn't doing well with the news of her brother's death. It was close to 3 a.m, and James couldn't sleep. He lay there staring up at the ceiling, replaying the entire day in his mind, and no matter how hard he tried, he just couldn't make sense of it. Kim, who was in the room down the hall, had been acting strange since the police station. He didn't know if it was the shock of it all, or if she was blocking it from her memory. But he was worried about her. Quietly slipping out of bed, James crossed the room and stepped out into the hall, doing his best to not wake his aunt. He went to Kim's room and opened the door. She wasn't there. Moving through the darkened hall, he started to hear her voice, humming the same tune she'd been repeating since they stopped at the store. A million thoughts raced through his mind. He hoped she was just messing around, but in the back of his mind, he had a bad feeling. There were only 3 bedrooms in his aunt's house. If Kim wasn't with him, and she wasn't in her room, that only left 1. Swallowing the lump in his throat, he made his way to his aunt's room, only to find the door cracked open. His heart was racing now. Beads of sweat formed on his face, and as he pushed the door open, he froze. Kim was standing, facing Tabitha's bed, with her back to the door. She was still, humming, and hadn't noticed him entering the room. Maybe it was the dark, or maybe he just couldn't imagine Kim hurting anyone. But he hadn't paid attention to what she clutched in her right hand. "Come on, Dot, you've got to stop goofing around. Let's get you back to bed," he whispered, placing a hand on her shoulder. Her nightgown was sticky and wet. In the dark, he couldn't tell what he'd touched, but he just assumed it had been water or something she'd gotten into, fumbling around without lights. Kim didn't respond. Her body was rigid as she continued humming that same tune from the radio. He tried shaking her a little, but she wouldn't budge. "Fine," he muttered, reaching to turn on the nearby lamp on the nightstand. When the light flooded the room, Kim spun around and screamed. She was covered in blood and holding a knife. James gasped and staggered back as she swiped at him with the blade, barely missing. Swinging wildly, still humming, Kim charged at her brother. who was backpedaling, holding out his hands to stop her attack. The knife sliced through his palm, and he screamed, "Fuck!" repeating into the hall. Kim advanced as he turned and ran towards the front of the house with her hot on his tail. James sprinted down the hall, through the living room and out of the front door. Once he was out of the house, there was no way she could keep up, but that didn't stop her from trying. James screamed for help as he ran, but there was no time to waste waiting for someone to hear it. He didn't know his neighbourhood. They hadn't spent much time with Tabitha over the years, so it didn't take long before he was completely lost. The first place he came to was a community centre that was attached to the local park. Panicking, he rushed the door and tried to pull it open, but it was locked. James watched the street for a second, till he caught sight of Kim still searching for him, and he hid in the bushes. Crouching down, staying as quiet as possible, he watched her getting closer. He knew he could overpower her, but he didn't want to hurt her. She was all he had left in this world. He couldn't imagine being without her. From his hiding spot, he watched her pass right by without noticing he was there. The second her back was to him, James rushed her, tackling her to the ground, causing her to drop the knife. She screamed like a wild animal, thrashing under his weight, but there was nothing she could do. "Dot, please, stop! I don't want to do this! Please, Dot, just stop!" he yelled, with tears streaming from his eyes. As he struggled to keep her pinned to the ground, she kept fighting, thrashing against his weight, as the street lit up with red and blue lights from incoming police cars. There was a moment of relief when he saw them that was quickly replaced by confusion and fear when they jumped out and began ordering him to let go of Kim. He tried to explain, but from their point of view, it looked like he was assaulting her. Before he could utter another word, they were pulling him off her. "You don't understand. She's trying to kill me. Don't let her up," he yelled as they dragged him away. The first officer helped Kim up, and the second she was on her feet, she grabbed the knife off the ground and stabbed him in the crotch. James, who was now in cuffs, watched in disbelief as the officer screamed in pain, falling to the ground. The second officer that was detaining James turned when he heard the scream and drew his sidearm. "Put the knife down," he ordered, but she just stood there smiling and humming to herself. He barked out the same orders over and over, but she wasn't listening. Never taking her eyes off of her brother, she smiled one last time, then charged. James screamed, "No!" but his words fell on deaf ears as the officer fired, twice stopping her in her tracks. Kim's body lay there in the street as paramedics arrived. James sat crying in the back of the police car, watching his sister's corpse. He couldn't believe it. His entire family was gone. There was no one left but him. Maybe it was the chaos of the moment, or maybe he was imagining it, but he could have sworn he'd seen Dot's fingers moving. Blinking, trying to focus on her hands, he watched as one by one she started moving her fingers. Then she sat up. In a flash, she was on her feet, jumping onto the back of the nearest paramedic and biting into her neck, ripping away a mouthful of meat as the woman spun around, trying to get Kim off of her. More people rushed over trying to help, only to get bitten or scratched. They were eventually able to get her under control, but the damage was done. The first paramedic that was bitten died before anyone could help her. And while the others were being treated, she got up. James couldn't believe what he was seeing. He watched the paramedic scrambling to her feet before running at the cops full speed, tackling one of them, tearing into him before the others could pull her away. While they wrestled with her, screams erupted from the ambulance. Kim had gotten loose. From where he was, James could see what was happening inside, but the action on the street was terrifying. One of the officers that were wrestling with the medic was now fighting for his life. The second of the two was crawling away, gushing blood from the right side of his face, which had been nearly torn off. The officer fighting with the medic managed to pull his gun during the struggle and fire a shot into her stomach. It didn't stop her. She bit into the forearm he was using to keep her off him, and when she did, he brought the gun up and shot her in the head. Closing his eyes nervously, bouncing his right knee, James listened to the chaos outside the car. Rapid-fire flashbacks raced through his mind, stopping at an image of his sister. She was standing in the store smiling at him, humming the tune that was playing in the background. He smiled at her for a second and started to cry while rocking in his seat. Without noticing it, he'd started humming the tune to himself. It was as if he could hear it playing in his mind, and as it did, the screams and gunfire drifted further and further away. The heartache, the pain, the insane sadness that followed his every breath faded. There was only the song now. A tingling cold sensation exploded at the base of his skull and flowed down through his body to his toes. Slowly opening his eyes, still humming to himself, he stared straight ahead and smiled as he rocked in his seat.